Hello, my name is s.kaner. I'm the Executive Director of the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures in Norwich in the east of England, and I'm also the Director for the Centre for Japanese Studies at the University of East Anglia, also here in Norwich. It's a great pleasure to be able to introduce some of my own research. I'm an archaeologist and I work on prehistoric Jōmon archaeology and also on the archaeology of the east of England. And today I'm going to talk to you about a project which I'm very pleased with, which we called Stonehenge and the Jomon, comparing the most famous of all the stone circles we have in the UK with some materials from Akita prefecture itself. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Travis Senzaki and all of his colleagues at the Akita International University. I'm delighted that the University of East Anglia, or UEA as we know it, has such a warm relationship with AIU and that students from UEA enjoy their time so much in Akita and vice versa. So the project I'm going to talk to you about today is about prehistoric stone circles. And if I could ask you to cast your mind back, well, actually not cast your minds back, but allow your minds to go back over 5,000 years, long time ago, before rice farming had arrived in Japan, and indeed just at the cusp of the beginnings of agriculture in the British Isles in Europe as well. Rice had been cultivated in China for about 4,000 years by this point, but it was going to take another 4,000 years or so for it to arrive in the Japanese archipelago. Before the arrival of rice, the Japanese archipelago was occupied by people who made ceramic vessels, but lived by hunting, gathering and fishing in what is known as the Jōmon period, a period that takes its name from the cord-marked decoration on the ceramics of the age. Stonehenge is perhaps the most famous prehistoric archaeological monument anywhere in the world. It's been a World Heritage Site since 1983, and in recent years there has been a lot of new research undertaken on this very significant monument. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about that research and how I feel it relates to some of the ideas which are emanating from the Jōmon period of Akita prefecture in particular. Although it seems like an incredibly long way between the British Isles and Japan at either end of Eurasia, if you work it out, if you were used to walking considerable distances, as indeed many hunter-gatherers were, I reckon that it would have been possible to complete that journey on foot long before the days of flying in about a year, maybe a little bit longer. It takes about 20 hours by plane these days, including connections to get from Norwich to Akita. But if you think about it in the longer term of things, a year's walking perhaps wouldn't be so outrageous. However, there is no evidence whatsoever of any direct contact between the Japanese archipelago and the British Isles in prehistory, although they were making things that are roughly comparable. For the last couple of decades, I've been very fortunate to be able to visit Akita prefecture on a number of occasions, and I've been shown around by the archaeologists in Akita, and there have been two sites in particular that have really caught my attention. The first is the Isedotai stone circles in Kitaakita city, a group of four circular arrangements of stone piles, if you like, which has also produced many wonderful artifacts of the Jōmon period. The site was discovered and excavated in advance of a new access road that was being constructed to Kitaakita airport, although as you can see in the picture here, the road was eventually put on a detour so that the site itself could be preserved. The other site, and probably the more famous of the two, are the AIU stone circles in Kazuno city, also in Akita prefecture. These stone circles have been known for a long time and were fully investigated just after the Second World War. Both of these sites comprise part of the Jōmon World Heritage Site of the northern sites of Jōmon, Japan. Obviously, they're called stone circles, or stone sakuru in Japanese. And I've long harboured a desire to really compare what we know of stone circles in the British Isles, such as Stonehenge, and these Jōmon stone circles. The Jōmon ones in particular are very unusual because they are real monuments built by hunter-gatherer peoples, and around the world that is quite a rare phenomenon from ancient times until the present. One of the themes that it's possible to compare is the ways in which these sites were oriented towards the movement of heavenly bodies at particularly key times of year, notably the summer solstice and the winter solstice. And this diagram here demonstrates at the Oyu stone circles, the twin stone circles of Oyu, just how these two sites are aligned indeed on the sunrise of the winter solstice and the sunset of the summer solstice. In terms of chronology, these sites are remarkably similar. Stonehenge itself was built during the early and late Neolithic periods, as you can see on this slide, some 5,000 to 4,500 BP or years ago, so about 3,000 BC. That's not all that dissimilar to the dates for the Oyu and Isedotai stone circles and a number of other very significant sites that we know of in Japan. And one of my questions has been, why at this time were human populations at either end of the Eurasian continent interested in building such stone monuments? There's been a lot of recent work done on the landscape around the stone circle at Stonehenge, and there are now suggestions that the river Avon, which today is not a very significant river, played a very important part in structuring the landscape around this important monument. And in Akita prefecture as well, the two rivers closest to the stone circles are Isedotai and Oyu, also seem to have played a very important role in structuring the landscape, and understanding the ways in which rivers formed boundaries, if you like, but also routes of communication for these prehistoric groups is becoming a very interesting theme, which we're going to be exploring more in future research. We know that very particular types of stones were selected to build these stone circles. There's a lot of recent excitement in the British academic world about news that some of the stones used at Stonehenge, for example, the blue stones that make up the central part of the monument, were imported to Stonehenge from about 250 kilometres to the west in what is now the country of Wales. And one of the very large stones, the so-called slaughter stone, which has been hidden from view for many years by earth that was covering it, is now thought to perhaps have come from as far afield as Scotland. Now, these are immensely heavy stones, and so moving them these distances is a very considerable undertaking. And we know that at Isedotai and at Oyu, very particular types of stones, at Isedotai in particular, different colours of stones were being selected, and this tells us something about perhaps the aesthetic choices of these prehistoric people, but also that they were distinguishing between different coloured stones, different types of stones, telling us quite a lot about the way that they saw themselves within their landscape. We also know that these sites did not exist in isolation. They were at the centre of clusters of monuments, different types of monuments, both in Salisbury Plain and in Akita, and they were in landscapes that had been occupied for very considerable amounts of time. Close to Stonehenge, for example, we've now found very good evidence that very large animals were being hunted some 11,000 years ago. So that's 6,000 years before the monuments at Stonehenge were being constructed. And Neolithic peoples were burying their deceased in major monuments, such as these long barrows, close to the monument, relatively in the same landscape as Stonehenge as well. And indeed, we know that the stone circles at Oyu and Isedotai were both used for funerary purposes. All these sites have long history of research, and the history of research is something that we are looking into in some detail at the moment. Here's John Aubrey, one of the early antiquarians who became very interested in Stonehenge and recorded it in great detail, allowing us to reconstruct the various phases of Stonehenge. Another thing that struck me as being of great interest is the fact that at Stonehenge we have a number of roadways which lead to the site, and the site itself is enclosed by ditches. At Isedotai, the black lines that you can see on the plan on the right also indicate that there were ditches and potential trackways being constructed in the area of the stone circles, and this again is something that I think will be of great interest in the future. Just up the road from Stonehenge, about an hour to the north, also on Salisbury Plain, are the Avebury stone circles. This is the largest set of stone circles in the British Isles, and indeed one of the largest prehistoric monuments anywhere in the world. You can see from the photograph on the left, during excavations in the 1910s and 1920s, just how deep those original ditches were. We know that at Avebury there was possibly an early burial around which the rest of the monument formed over the successive centuries, and this is also true at Stonehenge. And we also know that at the stone circle sites in Akita prefecture at AIU and Isedotai, many of the stone arrangements cover burials, and there are grave goods from those burials as well. There's been a lot of work done, as I said, on the origins of these stones. Here in the middle you can see a photograph of a little village close to Stonehenge, demonstrating where the stones came from and what they look like in their natural state. And at AIU, there has been a lot of work done understanding how far away the many, many thousands of stones that were brought to the stone circle were brought, potentially transporting them along the River AIU as well. I mentioned that there are many different types of sites around the Stonehenge landscape, and this is true at Avebury as well. The map on the left just gives you some idea of the complexity of monuments that are there, including sites such as Durrington Walls, which we think is probably the settlement where the people who built Stonehenge lived, and the Cursus, which seems to have been some enormous ceremonial precinct just to the north of Stonehenge itself. Recent work at Durrington Walls, close to the River Avon, has cast a lot of new light on what was going on at the time that Stonehenge was built, including, as you can see, a number of enclosures and buildings, indeed some of the best preserved Neolithic houses that we have from the British Isles. Here's a reconstruction of the floor of one, prepared by colleagues at the University of Bournemouth, with a reconstruction of what the house looked like. Note the central half, slightly dug into the ground. And it's directly comparable to the very few Neolithic buildings we did know about, for example, those in Orkney, sites like Skara Brae, where here you can see a 5,000-year-old circular-shaped house built of stone. There's even a stone bed and a stone display cabinet, along with the stone hearth in the centre of the house. And it's possible now to come up with reconstructions of what Durrington Walls and these Neolithic settlements at the time of the building of Stonehenge actually look like. This is equally true for AIU and Isedotai, where there are now good evidence for a number of what we call post-built structures and indeed pit buildings around the monument itself. This has changed the way we understand this site. We used to think that these cemeteries existed in isolation, but we now know that there were architectural remains built there as well. All around the Stonehenge landscape, there are many thousands of what we call barrows, prehistoric burial mounds, from a period slightly later than the period during which Stonehenge itself was built. And some of these tombs have produced very wonderful artifacts as grave goods, notably here from a site which contains gold and bronze objects, some of which extraordinarily high status, suggesting here we have a chief or somebody perhaps even in charge of the construction of Stonehenge, And I want to draw your attention in particular to this gold lozenge. And it's interesting to compare that to the small clay plaque found at AIU. Both of these seem to indicate an understanding of mathematics very early on. Mathematics, of course, would be needed in some way to be able to lay out circles and to be able to predict the movement of heavenly bodies, which seem to have been so important to both of these sites. Now, archaeology in Japan has a long and distinguished history. Here in 1868, Augustus Wollaston Franks, the pioneering curator of the British Museum, was already publishing papers about the ideas around the Stone Age of Japan. But arguably it wasn't until 1877 and Edward Sylvester Morse's investigations at the Aomori shell middens that Western-style archaeology was introduced into Japan. And indeed, Morse produced the first published archaeological report from the Aomori shell middens. About 10 years after that, from 1888 to 1891, Tsuboi Shogoro, the first professor of anthropology at the University of Tokyo, came to study in London with this man, Edward Burnett Tyler, the father of British social anthropology. And following Tsuboi's visit to the UK, this article by Saito was published in the Journal of the Anthropological Society of Tokyo in 1895, and I think these are the first drawings of Stonehenge in a Japanese journal. We know that large stone monuments can be found in other parts of Europe, and sometimes they're threatened, they're endangered. Here in France, in Brittany, a very famous site called Carnac, last year, a number of menhirs, a number of the standing stones were destroyed in advance of development. And indeed at Stonehenge itself, the landscape has been under threat through a new road scheme which was designed to alleviate the traffic problems around Stonehenge. Now, tunnels are nothing new, and tunnel schemes are nothing new. Here we have one, and you can see underneath Stonehenge there is a tunnel taking horses and carriages. This is a scheme from the 19th century, when there were already regarded as too many tourists passing by this important site. Rather similar to what we have in Hokkaido at Washinoki, where a tunnel carries the highway from Hakodate to Sapporo beneath the site, preserving the stone circles in situ. I'm actually recording this in Otaru in Hokkaido. And Neil Gordon Munro, very important early archaeologist of Japan who wrote the first synthesis of Japanese archaeology, undertook research at this site called Oshoro in Hokkaido, just up the road from where I'm going to go and visit, hopefully later today. And he also noticed the orientation of some of these tombs. Now, in the last couple of minutes, I just want to give you an idea of the exhibition that we showed at Stonehenge in 2022 to 2023. This is the old visitor centre at Stonehenge. Some 10 years ago, this very fine new visitor centre was constructed, along with some reconstructed Neolithic houses. It puts me in mind of the very fine visitor centre and museum at the Isedotai site, and indeed at AIU as well. There's a huge amount to read about Stonehenge in English, even a little bit in Japanese. And indeed, there's a similar amount to read in Japanese about all of the Jōmon stone circles. Many of the things that are important about the Jōmon have been brought together in recent years in the inscription of 17 Jōmon sites in northern Japan as UNESCO World Heritage. And here they are. I was fortunate enough to be involved in that initiative from very early on, and here we are in 2012 visiting the UNESCO ambassador from Japan in Paris. So the exhibition, as I said, was on for a year. First time that English Heritage, the equivalent of the Japanese Bunkacho, had engaged with Japan and done an international exhibition like this. We even had our own yuru kyaras designed by the exhibition designers. First time that we had sake served at an opening of an exhibition at Stonehenge. And the then Japanese ambassador, Ambassador Hayashi, and his wife came down and opened the exhibition for us. We showed some materials that related to the date of Stonehenge in Japan, such as these flame pots from Niigata prefecture. And we also investigated the history of research, in particular around a man called William Gowland, who had lived for many years in Japan before returning to the UK to undertake some of the best early excavations at Stonehenge. We were able to display these objects in specially designed cases and present some of the archaeology of Akita Prefecture at this most iconic of archaeological sites. And we were able to commission a special new reconstruction of the Oyu stone circles by the wonderful artist Akita Hokkaido. We were able to put on some of the remarkable objects that have been found from the Jōmon sites and to understand how much these sites are appreciated by their Japanese curators and general public. We had a wonderful team, very professional, organised by English Heritage, who they all are. And our installation coincided with some of the very major public events that happen at Stonehenge, such as the autumn solstice. Even the buses that transport the visitors to Stonehenge these days were decorated with Jōmon materials. And we organised workshops where people could come and make their own Jōmon pots and figurines that were hugely popular. We coincided with a little bit of Japanese media attention as well. We were able to come back to Japan in February last year and talk about the way that the exhibition had been put together and thank all of the people in Japan who had made it possible. And we were very struck by the new technologies which are now on display at these site museums. Sadly, we came in the winter, so as all of you in Akita will realise, it wasn't possible to actually see the sites themselves. But there were other similarities that we thought. The polished stone balls from many of the Neolithic sites and the polished stone bars from the Jōmon sites. Many areas here for future research. We tried to publish something of what we've been doing in Japanese as well as in English. And we also have a special exhibition now at Avebury up the road, introducing more about the stone circles, which is ongoing. And we organised a conference, courtesy of the Japan Foundation, which attracted many people, both specialists and the general public, many of whom returned to hear the first performance by Japanese taiko drummers at the closing ceremony of the exhibition. And we were able to take our ideas to the European Association of Archaeologists. I hope I've been able to give you a brief idea of just one of the many research projects that we're engaged in looking at the archaeology, art and cultures of Japan. And I'd be very much looking forward to my next visit to Akita and very much hope we can welcome visitors from Akita to come and join us in the UK as well. Thank you very much indeed for your attention.